I'll begin with segment 1 of section 1 by trying to answer Pete Bagley's call, a personal reminder to interested parties in the future, such as an alert historian. Uncovering Popov's Mole, Breakthrough. Veteran researcher and authority on Cold War history, Peter Dale Scott, coined the phrase Popov's Mole decades ago. My recent volume 4, Uncovering Popov's Mole, has become the starting point for a complete overhaul of all my research since 1988, when I began work on my George Washington University dissertation, JFK and Vietnam. In fact, the short-lived and unsuccessful attempt to suppress the publication of volume 4 parallels the successful 2-year suppression of JFK and Vietnam after it was published in 1992. The best platforms for the renovation of my previous 46 years of works are YouTube and my website, jfkjmn.com. After reviewing Uncovering Popov's Mole, the next section reviews the 2017 edition of JFK and Vietnam. The above opening slide mentioned that just before his passing, Pete appealed to future historians to identify the ghosts of the spy wars. Uncovering Popov's Mole also functions as the ideal place to answer his call. And for these reasons, the YouTube renovation of my works will begin with Volume 4, Uncovering Popov's Mole. I am a person in the future. Whether or not I'm alert is something I'll let you decide. This is an interesting comparison written by James Kenneth Galbraith, a professor, a graduate professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and the son of the famous John Kenneth Galbraith, who was an advisor to several U.S. presidents, including President Kennedy. I'll let you look at that in your own time, that comparison, and decide what you will of it. This slide covers my background from 1992 to 2022. On the left-hand side is my service in the Army. It began as an enlisted NCO, non-commissioned officer, and was commissioned from the ranks as an officer in 1980 as a first lieutenant, promotable. And eventually, I rose rather quickly to the top of the National Security Agency, where I worked for the director, General William Odom. He helped me get an assignment after we were done in Hong Kong as an China attaché. And after a final tour for the Assistant Chief of Staff of Intelligence in the Army, I retired. On the right-hand side are my degrees at George Washington University, which ended with a PhD in Modern Far Eastern History in '92. And then below that are all the books that I've published. You can look at this slide in your leisure and study it. I would just end by saying that I taught for 20 years with the University of Maryland Honors College. I began in 1991, and in 2011, I decided to retire from a full professorship to an adjunct professorship that was offered to me by James Madison University in 2011. I'm still there, and I'm loving every minute of it. I want to go to a couple of items that I brought up in the introduction to Uncovering Popov's Mole. And the first one is the importance of location in espionage, in particular for high echelon penetrations. So a properly located high echelon mole, or also we use the term staff echelon, in the enemy spy service is the ultimate penetration, because it can render that service an extension of one's own service, which offers access to the enemy's headquarters and all their overseas stations. Like murder, there must be a location for the deed, and encrypted messages are vulnerable to being broken. So to protect such an ultimate penetration, only face-to-face meetings in a safe location with the friendly service can ensure the viability of their penetration. Clearly, the necessity of travel to safe locations is the only way to protect staff-level penetration, but it's also an Achilles heel. Bruce Sully, who, as you know, I'm examining in this volume 4, Uncovering Popov's Mole, I'm examining the evidence that he was the mole himself. Now, with respect to travel, Bruce Sully's travel records were put on the Ancestry.com database in 2010. And although I had worked on Bruce Sully's ancestry tree in 2017, it was not until I began work on the current Volume 4, Uncovering Popov's Mole, in early 2022 that the high value of Sully's travel records became clear to me. Most of Sully's travel records in the Middle East, for example, and Europe also, fall directly on places and times where KGB equities, significant KGB equities, were in play. Sully's flight manifests and his travel vouchers and his changes to his luggage tags, such as those that were witnessed by Soviet Navy Captain Artemov's wife after Artemov was murdered, show that Sully attempted to practice spy tradecraft. Apparently, however, he did not envision that his travel records would become public one day. And another item that I'm going to pull out of the introduction to discuss briefly here is the value of character development in books or works on spies. In works that include researching the true allegiance of a spy, trying to figure out which side he's on or she, a valuable methodology to unmask the spy is focusing on how he or she developed over time as the manuscript on the book or the work moves forward and backward through time. It goes back and forth to keep comparing these different slices of time. It's akin to a military methodology we call the preparation of the battlefield. It's a methodology of using vertically stacked transparencies. And in the Army, we're really actually using transparent plastic sheets of paper to look at all these different things. Enemy dispositions, friendly force dispositions, the terrain, is there light at night, and all kinds of other things are put together and then shown on a sand table, and the commander will come in and look at all those transparencies at the same time and make the decision on how to fight the war. Anyway, in terms of writing a book, and especially in mine, what it means is that time and again, the text of the manuscript will go forward and backward to revisit and compare these important different sources of the spy's history. We must scrutinize behavior over time. And finally, with respect to methodology, attestation from multiple independent sources is crucial. Nothing was ever really made or discovered, whether it's astrophysics or chemistry or just plain old police work, without making mistakes and having to recorrect the course time and time again until you get the final result. Anyway, some of these types of disparate sources would include the primary or secondary and graduate schools of the person we're looking into, the spy we're looking into, their marriages and divorces, his or her performance in military service, the background checks that are done if we can get our hands on them, whether or not he or she can or can't control eating and drinking and smoking and substance abuse. Are there unstable problems in employment? What is their state of physical fitness? That makes a big deal to how fit your brain is, and crucially, travel records. Several of these sources combined can help us uncover the allegiances and bona fides of a spy. All right, summarizing what we've done here, Section 1, the one that we're just beginning, is the beginning of my overhaul of the past several decades of research and publications. It is the fourth volume in my work on the Cold War and JFK's presidency. It is named Uncovering Popov's Mole and explores the evidence that Bruce Sully was the KGB mole in the CIA. He was never uncovered for the past 70 years. Okay, we're moving on to slide set A2. We're still working on answering Pete Bagley's call for a reminder to interested parties in the future about an alert, maybe perhaps an alert historian, to later arrest the ghosts of the spy wars. And there you have the lineup of the researchers who've been a part of this quest for finding Popov's mole. Pete Bagley, who got things started with his work for the CIA way back when. Eventually, Peter Dale Scott took an interest in it and coined the phrase that we use today, Popov's mole. And more recently, Malcolm Blunt and myself, who began to question, in fact, suspect that Bruce Sully might have been that mole. A new working hypothesis. 6 years of work on Volume 3, Into the Storm and Armageddon, which is now Volume 5, produced clues pointing to Popov's mole, a 70-year-old operation. Popov's mole was a KGB penetration of the CIA that has never been uncovered. That raises an unanswered question. When and from whom did the KGB mole in the CIA find out about Popov's treason and warning about a staff-level mole? The answer to that destroyed an axiom that I and many others had long taken for granted, the so-called Angleton mole hunt. In 1958, Pyotr Popov warned George Kieswalter about the mole. Then the news went to counterintelligence chief James Angleton, and then he in turn passed it on to the mole hunter in the CIA Office of Security, Bruce Sully. Well, when further investigation showed a high probability that the mole hunter himself might have been the mole, we realized that much of what we thought we knew about the upper echelons of the CIA was no longer tenable. We found ourselves suddenly confronting Bruce Sully in a false mole hunt. I and many others had assumed it had been the Angleton mole hunt. Well, the time has come to abandon the notion of the Angleton mole hunt. Popov defected in Vienna, Austria. In early November 1951, Popov dropped a note into an American diplomat's car offering to defect for money. This cornerstone moment of the Cold War was also a cornerstone event in the history of the KGB-CIA spy wars. The KGB-CIA struggle over Popov's treason would last until January 1957. At that time, Khrushchev had all but defeated his rivals in the struggle to become Stalin's successor as premier of the Soviet Union. In January 1957, the KGB section chief, working against the American embassy in Moscow, Vladislav Kovshuk, went on a 10-month covert mission to Washington, D.C., and there he met with the KGB mole, who was in the most trusted abode of CIA security, the Security Office. The mole confirmed that the identity of the GRU traitor operating in Central Europe was, in fact, Pyotr Popov. Eventually, Popov's luck ran out. Fortunately, it ended a few months just before Popov learned about a high-echelon KGB mole in the CIA in time to report it. Popov's defection in Vienna. Quote, I am a Russian officer attached to the Soviet group of forces headquarters in Baden-Baden. If you are interested in buying a copy of the new table of organization for a Soviet armored division, meet me on the corner of Dorotergasse and Stahlbergasse at 8:30 p.m. November the 12th. If you are not there, I will return at the same time on November 13th, 1951. The price is 3,000 Austrian shillings. Popov's defection took place as nuclear weapons in the Cold War were intensifying. This was a defection like none other. The KGB-CIA spy wars exploded over Popov's treason. Popov was flawed. He drank way too much and he ran insane risks just to impress his CIA case officer, George Kieswalter. Popov loved his wife and children, but he was hopelessly devoted to a mistress. For 6 reckless years, he passed Soviet secrets to the CIA, saving the United States $500 million in military research, by the way. In April 1958, a year after the KGB told Kovshuk about Popov's treason, Popov told Kieswalter he had overheard a GRU, that GRU is Soviet military intelligence, he had overheard a GRU officer boast that the KGB mole in the CIA had provided the complete technical details of the CIA's secret U-2 operations of the KGB. In the ensuing Cold War battle of the spy services, the counterintelligence chiefs and the KGB and the CIA locked horns, attempting to neutralize the successful penetration by the other side. In 1958, the chief of the KGB Second Chief Directorate, Major General Oleg Gribanov, sought a deception plan that would enable the KGB to isolate and then arrest Popov, but without endangering the KGB mole in the CIA, who is the real source. Fooling the CIA's counterintelligence chief, James Jesus Angleton. In July 1956, when the CIA's U-2 spy planes first overflew the Soviet Union, it was game on. In August 1956, a KGB espionage campaign was put together. It not only targeted Pyotr Popov, but also the CIA's counterintelligence chief, James Angleton. Angleton had to be deceived into looking for the mole in the wrong place. And that wrong place that was decided upon was the Soviet Russia division. Makes sense, Soviet mission. Gribanov sent Vladislav Kovshuk to meet the KGB mole in the CIA to coordinate the details of the deception plan he wanted, and then to put the plan into play. Because U-2 overflight surveillance was the ostensible trigger for these spy wars at this time, a false defector, Lee Harvey Oswald, was dispatched to Moscow as bait. He had been involved in the tracking of U-2 flights over the Soviet Union from Atsugi, Japan, and he was dangled as U-2 flypaper, ostensibly to help uncover the KGB mole in the CIA back in Washington, but in fact not to find the true mole, Bruce Sully. Many years later, Angleton was fired in 1974. Only then did he find out the reason for the failure to find the mole in the Soviet Russia division. The KGB mole in the CIA was the most important KGB spy ever during the Cold War. Although Popov had made mistakes often that put the KGB onto his treason, they waited patiently while cunning preparations were made to arrest him. By the time they were able to do that, without endangering Sully, their true KGB source in the CIA, for 6 years, Popov had trundled bales of top-secret information out of the secret centers of Soviet power. In the process, he had shattered the Soviet Military Intelligence Service, the GRU. Popov had caused the transfer of the KGB chief, a 4-star general. And finally, Popov has saved the United States, as I said before, $500 million in military research. In sum, by the time the dust settled in this hard-fought battle of the spy services, Popov had long since been trapped, tried, and executed. Of course, the mole hunt could never find the KGB mole in the Soviet Russia division. Moreover, as we will see, by 1965, Bruce Sully's power would expand exponentially while Pete Bagley's star was falling. As a result, the agency's operations against the Soviet Union would be laying in smoldering ruins. Although the KGB won that battle, it didn't win the war. At the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union ended up as a carcass. We turn now to slide set A3 and begin with the dangerous time of Popov's defection during the Cold War. As discussed in the previous slides in A2, Popov's defection happened at the end of 1951 and early 1952. It was a frightening time in the Cold War. By the end of the Truman presidency, the Korean War was taking place as both the United States and Soviet Union were testing and building nuclear weapons. On one of Popov's trips back to Moscow, he had been based in Vienna, Popov succeeded in stealing data on the Soviet nuclear program and passing it to the CIA. But the KGB was also stealing important secrets from the CIA. Armageddon, President Truman and the hydrogen bomb. On 1 November 1952, the first hydrogen bomb ever tested, codenamed Mike, was part of the Lawrence Livermore Lab's Operation Ivy. Mike was detonated on Inuitak Atoll and had a yield of 10.4 megatons. Some of the scientists who had helped build Mike questioned whether it was more destructive than any war aim could justify. By this time, the Cold War was unstoppable. If the U.S. could build an H-bomb, the Soviets could too. Months later, the Soviets tested a bomb that came close to matching the explosive power of the American H-bomb. And so, the race was on to build these preposterous super bombs in huge numbers. Armageddon, Truman, Korea, and the Moscow code clerk. Only 8 people in the world, aside from KGB officer Sergei Kondrashev, were aware of the details of a cipher break by Jack, a code name for the U.S. code clerk in Moscow. Kondrashev skillfully used a sex trap to easily get Jack to give the Soviets what every government most wants, and having obtained, most needs to hide, the ability to read the secret communications of its rivals and its potential enemies. Soviet Minister of Security, Viktor Abakumov, told Kondrashev that these authentic insights into American thinking had been especially persuasive for Stalin at this particular moment, which was in early 1949. Stalin, knowing from the cipher break that the U.S. military Pacific defensive perimeter would not include South Korea, decided it was a propitious moment to announce the evacuation of Russian troops from North Korea to see if the United States would follow suit in South Korea. Truman, Korea, and the Moscow code clerk. Stalin's move was a devious device. It was meant to test, first of all, the secret information about American intentions in Korea that had been gained from the cipher machine break that resulted from the KGB recruitment of Jack. They wanted to make sure that, in fact, it was working. Well, it did work. Truman then directed MacArthur to remove all U.S. troops from South Korea. They went for it. Those troops were gone by the end of June 1949, at which point MacArthur's responsibility for South Korea ceased. Interestingly, consequently, in Atchinson's speech, he was a presidential advisor, in which there was an omission of Korea from America's defense perimeter. The American withdrawal drew little attention until later when the North Korean attack actually came on 25 June 1950. Jack's information had enabled the KGB to assemble a copy of the entire machine, and they could read secret American diplomatic and military communications between Washington and all the American posts around the world. Although this revelation was released in Pete Bagley's book, 2013, for the first time, his book was named Spy Master, it's astonishing that no other published observer has noticed this expose except for my 2019 Volume 3, Into the Storm. The code break is what started the war in Korea. Popov's mistress, Lyuba. Meanwhile, as the Cold War was on the verge of becoming a hot war, the CIA urgently requested that a Russian-speaking case officer be sent to Vienna in time for another meeting with Popov. The case officer, George Kieswalter, was from the CIA's East European Division, and Kieswalter would remain as Popov's case officer for the next 6.5 years until Popov's arrest by the KGB. Popov had already provided the CIA with a new table of organization for a Soviet armored division with tactical nuclear weapons. However, at the end of the second session, Popov, whose family was in Russia, admitted to his case officer Kieswalter that he was having an affair with a Serb woman named Lyuba Bielik. Kieswalter was nonplussed. He said, "You know what kind of risk you're taking? One whiff of this and your ass will be back in Moscow." Kieswalter's chastisement of Popov soon proved to be prescient. Later on, an incident that had brought attention to Lyuba would eventually resurface to the KGB later. Popov's stony path into Soviet illegals operations. Popov also had a drinking problem, and it would get worse when he moved into a line of work involving Soviet illegals that could bring risks with it. Illegals were agents who, after a decade or even more of training, were posted abroad with false documentation, just like the TV show in America called The Americans. Popov ran into a drinking buddy in a bar. His name was Colonel Alexei Kryatov. Kryatov, by the end of Soviet occupation in Austria in June 1955, had acquired dozens of passports and many other documents, along with the critical rubber stamps, seals, and copies of the signatures, all of which was a treasure trove of aids for the use of illegals' operations. Meanwhile, Popov returned to duty in Moscow for 16 months, when in December 1956, Pete Bagley discovered that Popov had been transferred to Schwerin, East Germany. By this time, the first flights of the CIA's secret U-2 spy planes over the territory of the USSR were underway. This would not become known to Popov until 1958, shortly before he would be summoned to Moscow, where he was trapped until his trial and execution. Dark clouds had been gathering due to Popov's heavy drinking, his Yugoslav mistress, and a dangerous new line of work in illegals operations. Popov, Cold War escalation, and the explosion of the spy wars. Unsatisfied with the protests against the CIA U-2 overflights, the Soviet Union pressed the KGB's successful penetrations of the CIA to learn about the U-2 plane's full technical details. The 1956 U-2 flights over the USSR thus played a central role in the escalation of the KGB-CIA spy wars during the years 1957 to 1962. Popov's work at Schwerin was short-lived. In June 1957, he was transferred to the GRU Strategic Intelligence Unit in Karlshorst, East Berlin. Before arriving, Popov had carelessly contacted the CIA through British officers that he encountered in a restaurant and left them a note in the bathroom. The British officers unwittingly passed the information to the MI6 UK intelligence, where the KGB mole George Blake found out almost certainly this was passed on to MI6 headquarters in London. By that time, Kim Philby was the KGB mole who had escaped incarceration and was called back to duty and posted to Beirut. The incredible story of Kim Philby will be dealt with in section 2 of this presentation. It was also at that time that Vladislav Kovshuk had traveled covertly to Washington to meet with the KGB mole in the CIA. The confluence of Cold War events were beyond Popov's and the CIA's control at this point. Popov's illegals operations and the poisonous woman. While Popov was waiting for the transfer to East Berlin, Kovshuk and the KGB mole, Sully, and the CIA were meeting and working on Gribaunov's plan to create convincing scenarios with which to arrest Popov without uncovering Sully's crucial role. The illegal that Popov was in charge of was sent to Washington to make it appear that Popov had compromised her during her trip. During that trip, Kovshuk sent Sully to Central Europe to reconnoiter Popov's activities in Vienna and Berlin and find other data to use to create false means to arrest him. The KGB feigned concern over the blown Tyrova operation in New York and suddenly revived in 1958, as was Popov's affair with Lyuba Bielik. Lyuba had turned against communism after the Soviet suppression of the Hungarian revolt. She testified against the Austrian Communist Party, and in August 1958, she informed the Viennese police about her relationship with Popov. Well, that went right into the hands of the KGB. And Gribanov used these controlled preparations to summon Popov back to Moscow, use him to unmask other CIA agents, and then convict and execute Popov. The Tyrova affair from the beginning had been a trap for Popov to help create more excuses to arrest him. Before returning to Moscow, Popov managed to tell the CIA about the KGB mole in the agency. In April 1958, just a few months before Gribanov ordered Popov back to Moscow to face punishment for his treason, he managed to tell his case officer, George Kieswalter, that he overheard a fellow GRU officer at a meeting mention that there was a high echelon mole in the KGB, a KGB mole in the CIA. Moreover, the mole was high enough in the CIA to betray the technical details of the secret CIA U-2 spy plane. As previously mentioned, that news was sent to Angleton. Of course, Angleton immediately alerted Bruce Sully, the mole, and the research branch of the CIA research staff in the Office of Security. Although Angleton didn't know anything about it, Sully knew straight away that there would have to be a mole hunt. And Sully knew that he had plenty of time to design the mole hunt in a manner to protect himself. 18 months later, a false defector from America who had worked at a U-2 site at Sugi, Japan, named Lee Harvey Oswald, was sent to Moscow and dangled as U-2 flypaper. The lair of the KGB mole in the CIA, Sully falsely assured Angleton, had to be in the Soviet Russia division. In sum, I'm replacing the phrase the Angleton mole hunt with the phrase the CIA mole hunt. The phrase Angleton mole hunt concerns the use of a false defector in order to surface the mole, whereas my use of the phrase CIA mole hunt concerns the use of a false defector in a false mole hunt. In a false mole hunt, the purpose is not to find the mole. It doesn't matter whether or not the defector is bona fide. A bona fide defector, of course, would not willingly serve the purpose of the site he defected from. But what really matters the most is that this CIA mole hunt is meant to protect the mole by steering the hunt in the wrong direction.